Hello and welcome back to our channel, all you Beyond the Gates fans. Thank you for your trust and for supporting our channel over the past while. Everything I create is purely speculative and based on personal opinion. What do you think would happen if Bill discovered HAYLEY's scheme? Would he be able to accept that truth? And if he learned that Randy was the one who gave HAYLEY that terrifying thing, who would Bill's tidal wave of rage crash down on first, HAYLEY or Randy? Let's take a look at what Bill's revenge might look like. Bill had never imagined that the thing capable of making him tremble would not be a dirty file, an unpredictable trial, or an enemy clever enough to set a trap right in front of him. What truly shook him was the moment every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction, and that direction led straight to the woman he had chosen with all the belated recklessness of his life. For most of his life, Bill had lived by reason, by the predatory instincts of a seasoned lawyer, by his ability to see through other people's motives before they could hide them. He was used to controlling every variable, twisting circumstances in whatever way served him best, and maintaining the composure of a man who always held the advantage. That was why this collapse was not merely a blow to his marriage. It was a total destruction of his pride. Bill had not simply been betrayed. He had been exposed in front of the very image of himself he had long worshipped, a man who never allowed himself to become the victim. When he first began tracing the early signs, he still allowed himself a comforting escape route. Everything could still be explained as coercion, manipulation, another hand working behind the scenes. And the name that drove itself like a stake into his mind was Randy. Bill clung to that theory with a desperation so fierce it was almost frantic. He believed Randy had threatened HAYLEY, forced her to follow orders, turned her into a tool in a scheme she herself had not been strong enough to resist. That belief was not merely a legal assumption. It was the last shield protecting the part of his self-respect that was already cracking apart. If HAYLEY had been forced, Bill could still forgive himself. If HAYLEY was only a victim, then the love he had used to justify leaving Donnie, disappointing Chelsea and Naomi, was not entirely a foolish mistake. As long as he could hold on to that conclusion, he could continue living without having to face the truth that he had destroyed his own family with his own hands for an illusion. But the deeper Bill dug, the more what he found felt like a blade twisting inside his ego. Money had been moved with a precision that could not be explained by panic. Meetings had been arranged with enough distance and secrecy to fool outsiders, yet with far too much intent to be dismissed as actions made under duress. HAYLEY's movements did not resemble those of a frightened woman trying to escape. They resembled the quiet calculations of someone carefully planning every move. Every document, every timestamp, every small inconsistency in her version of events made the theory Bill wanted to believe grow weaker. He still tried to bend the truth into a shape he could endure. He still tried to push the blame onto Randy. He still tried to turn clear evidence into fragments that could be interpreted in a less painful way. But the more he denied it, the more he realized he was no longer arguing with anyone except himself. Humiliation began creeping into the silences. It was not loud like anger, nor sharp like betrayal. It was slow, heavy, and corrosive. Bill saw himself again in the years behind him, saw the way he had walked away from Donnie with the cold certainty of a man convinced he was doing the right thing for his own happiness. He had once called it honesty with his feelings. He had once convinced himself that a love arriving unexpectedly was enough to justify the hurt he had caused. But now, standing amid a pile of evidence suggesting the woman he had chosen might never have loved him in the way he imagined, Bill was forced to confront the ugliest possibility of all. Perhaps he had not been a brave man following his heart, but merely an aging, vain man who had been intoxicated by the feeling of being desired and had traded everything for a power rush disguised as love. That realization made him think of Donnie more than he wanted to admit. Not because he still hoped to return to her, but because guilt had become a persistent haunting presence. Donnie had once been the most stable part of his life, the foundation he treated as something permanent until he walked away from it himself. He had not only abandoned a marriage, He had shattered the trust of a woman who had stood beside him through the years when both his ambition and his cruelty were still being sharpened. Worse than that, he had forced Chelsea and Naomi to look at their father with disappointment. Two daughters who had once known him as sharp and dependable were now left watching him become selfish, impulsive, and willing to trample over his family for what he called destiny. Bill had believed he could survive their judgment as long as he still had HAYLEY beside him as proof that the price he paid had not been meaningless. But if HAYLEY had truly betrayed him, then that entire chain of decisions was not merely a mistake. It had become the bitterest joke of his life. That was why Bill's anger was not directed purely at HAYLEY. It was a composite rage, a fire fed by multiple sources: anger at being deceived, anger at being placed in a position of weakness, anger that his trust had been used as a weapon against him. And above all, anger because he realized he had helped create this disaster himself. That made his anger more dangerous. It did not merely explode outward. It turned inward as well, crushing his chest with a hatred he could barely name. For the first time in years, Bill felt a fear that was close to basic survival instinct. Not just fear of losing his reputation, or even fear of scandal if everything became public, but fear of the moment when the final shell of control would be stripped away, leaving beneath it an aging, lonely man standing on the wreckage of choices he himself had made. He began preparing the file almost as a reflex of his profession. Every document was arranged on the table with an almost obsessive precision. Photos, statements, bank records, time logs, fragments of evidence that seemed disconnected until they were placed together and formed a picture too horrifying for anyone to deny. At first glance, it looked like an effort to reclaim justice. Bill understood the value of truth better than anyone when it was framed by evidence. He could bring it all into the light, expose the conspiracy, drag Randy down, and force HAYLEY to face the consequences. But the longer he stared at the pile of papers, the more he understood that he was not merely preparing for an exposure. He was preparing for retaliation. The way he selected certain pieces of evidence, the way he held back some details because they would wound more deeply than they would simply accuse. The way he imagined the moment others would see the truth and be shocked by the extent of the betrayal. All of it made clear that this was no longer about principles. It was about a man wounded at his deepest core and searching for a way to make others taste the same degree of humiliation. And yet one part of Bill remained stubbornly resistant to the final conclusion. He needed Randy. He needed Randy not only as a target for his fury, but as a psychological lifeline. If Randy was the mastermind, if everything had begun with manipulation and coercion, then Bill could still preserve the last remnants of the old story. He had loved the wrong person, but not a monster. That was why Bill poured all of his aggression into Randy even before he fully confronted HAYLEY. He watched him, investigated him, rebuilt the network of connections, hunted for weaknesses, pressured anyone involved into revealing more. And each step uncovered a harder truth. Randy might be poisonous. He might know exactly how to exploit greed and fear in others, but not every action had come from his coercion. Some decisions had been HAYLEY's alone. There had been moments when she could have stopped, but she had not. She was not an unconscious pawn on the board. She was a player. That truth pushed Bill into a psychological abyss unlike anything he had ever experienced. To accept that HAYLEY had actively betrayed him meant accepting that he had misjudged her in the most catastrophic way possible. That was worse than simply being deceived. It meant he had chosen blindness. All his experience, all his sophistication, all his supposed ability to read people, everything that made up his pride, had failed against the woman lying beside him every night. That idea gnawed at him so deeply that extreme possibilities no longer appeared as meaningless flashes of temper, but as realistic options. He could expose everything, destroy Randy through the law, drag HAYLEY into the center of public scandal, and recast himself as the betrayed victim in order to regain control of the narrative. Or he could choose a darker, more absolute path, cut off the loose ends, erase Randy from the board, bury the truth with him, preserve the outward shell of the marriage, and construct a new facade before scandal had the chance to burn down his reputation. For a man like Bill, murder was not simply an act of violence. It was the absolute bankruptcy of the self he had spent a lifetime building. And the fact that the thought had even appeared was enough to show how far he had already been pushed. Bill began to realize that his greatest fear did not lie in making the wrong choice, but in the fact that once the truth came fully into the open, he would no longer control the way it was told. If Randy stayed alive and was cornered, he could reveal everything. He could expose details Bill did not yet know. He could prove that HAYLEY had not betrayed him only for money or because she was threatened, but also out of a quiet contempt for the husband who imagined himself loved. He could transform Bill from accuser into a publicly humiliated fool. And in Bill's world, where status was inseparable from power, public humiliation could be more destructive than any legal sentence. The mere thought of that possibility felt like something cold tightening around the back of his neck. For the first time, the man who always controlled the situation had to face the prospect of being stripped bare in broad daylight. The irony was that in his most dangerous moment, Bill also saw a part of himself he had always tried to avoid. Beneath the surface of the manipulator, the seasoned lawyer, the man who looked as if nothing could shake him, there still existed a child who had grown up with emotional deprivation, always haunted by the fear of not being enough. Success, power, the ability to dominate others, all of it had been walls he built around that wound. So HAYLEY's betrayal was not merely a blow to his present. It struck directly at his oldest fear, being used and discarded after offering what he believed had value. That feeling gave Bill's anger the color of a long-buried fury, as though every moment he had ever been dismissed, every moment he had ever been forced to prove his worth, had now erupted all at once through this one catastrophe. HAYLEY, for her part, could no longer hide behind the fragile mask of a panicked wife. She sensed the shift in Bill even before he laid the file on the table. The air around him had changed. It had become heavier, colder, quieter, and more dangerous. This was no longer a husband searching for an explanation. This was a prosecutor accumulating judgment, a wounded man calculating how to strike in the most painful way possible. HAYLEY may have entered this game believing she was clever enough to maneuver both Randy and Bill, that she only needed to walk the line carefully enough not to be crushed. But she had underestimated the degree of cruelty wounded pride could create inside Bill. In his eyes, her betrayal was not only that she had deceived him, it was that she had dared to make him look like a fool. That was something Bill could not forgive by instinct. And yet the closer he came to the moment of action, the more Bill was torn in two. One part of him wanted to reveal everything, tear apart the false shell, and use his own skills to destroy the people who had humiliated him. That part craved punishment as a way of restoring order. But the other part, deeper and more frightening, wanted to hide everything. Not because he still loved her completely, but because if the truth came out, he too would stand under the light of judgment. Then he could no longer be only the victim. He would be the man who had betrayed Donnie, who had disappointed his daughters, who had assumed he had the right to dictate the happiness of others, only to be devoured by that very choice in the end. To go public meant accepting judgment. To hide it meant continuing to live inside a marriage that had already rotted from within. Both paths were hell. They differed only in how they would burn him. If Bill chose to kill Randy, it would not be an act born of strength, but of absolute weakness. It would be a final effort to destroy the man holding up the mirror that reflected Bill's own foolishness, but Bill understood that. He knew killing Randy could not kill the truth, and it certainly could not kill the filth and shame eating away at him. Randy could disappear, but what HAYLEY had done would still remain, and what Bill had done to his own life would remain as well. And if he chose exposure, he would have to accept a different kind of pain, the pain of losing every illusion, the pain of seeing himself in the pity or mockery of others, the pain of admitting to Donnie, to Chelsea, to Naomi that they had been right to be disappointed in him. The hardest decision was not between forgiveness and revenge. It was between a brutal truth that might destroy him and a prolonged lie that would rot him from within. In that state, Bill no longer thought of love the way he once had. The lightning bolt romance he had once glorified now appeared as a glossy coat of paint over vanity and a crisis of aging. He had wanted to see himself as someone still capable of being desired, still capable of becoming the center of passion, still able to believe his life had not closed itself inside old obligations. HAYLEY had appeared at precisely the moment he needed an illusion like that. She made him feel chosen, admired, reawakened in ways he thought had long been buried beneath years of responsibility. But the more he examined it, the more Bill understood that what he had loved may never have been HAYLEY herself, but the version of himself he saw when standing beside her. That realization made the betrayal even more bitter. He had not only lost a person, he had lost the final illusion of the man he wanted to believe he still was. If Randy were pushed far enough to reveal the entire truth, Bill might be forced to hear things even more painful than the evidence itself. That HAYLEY had not been coerced from the beginning. That she had weighed benefits, calculated risks, used Bill's feelings and protective instincts to shield her own moves. That in the moments when Bill believed he was being trusted the most, he was in fact only being used most effectively. Confessions like that would hit harder than scandal ever could. They would cut into the deepest layer of his pride, where Bill still considered himself the one who understood the game better than anyone else. To accept them would mean admitting that this time, he had not simply lost, he had been led without ever realizing it. HAYLEY would eventually have to face that wave of rage, and the most terrifying part would not lie in shouting or sudden violence. The most terrifying part would lie in Bill's coldness once he had passed the first point of emotional collapse. A Bill who had lost control could be dangerous, but a Bill who had regained his composure after fully understanding he had been betrayed was far more dangerous. By then, all of that violent emotion would be compressed into decisions sharp as knives. He would not need to yell or explode. He would only need to arrange, remove, and place each person exactly where they would collapse on their own. HAYLEY would face not only the fury of a betrayed husband, but the cruelty of a man who felt his honor had been violated to the deepest degree. If she had once believed she could maneuver through tears, half-truths, and ambiguity long enough to buy time, she would soon learn that once Bill no longer wanted to believe, every soft strategy became meaningless. The problem was that Bill no longer knew what he truly wanted. He could not continue living with HAYLEY as though nothing had happened, because every glance, every gesture from her would now remind him of how thoroughly he had been deceived. But neither could he easily cut her off, because cutting her off meant publicly admitting the failure of a life choice he had defended at any cost. Perhaps he would keep her close only to punish her, turning the marriage into a cage where they both suffocated. Perhaps he would delay the final blow, not out of mercy, but because he wanted to watch her panic longer, wanted her to live in the dread of not knowing when the sentence would fall. And perhaps, in the darkest moment, he would truly consider erasing every loose and through an irreversible act. Every possibility revealed the same terrifying truth. Bill was no longer fighting simply to find the truth. He was fighting to decide which part of himself would survive after this disaster. In the end, the greatest question was not whether Bill had enough evidence to destroy Randy or HAYLEY, but whether he had enough courage to look directly at himself. Because the cruelest truth might not be that HAYLEY betrayed him, or even how much of the story Randy manipulated. The cruelest truth was that Bill had built an entire life-changing decision on his need to validate his own ego, and then called it love. If he accepted that, he might suffer. He might lose everything. He might be judged, but at least he would still have a path back to reality. If he continued to deny it, blamed everything on Randy, kept HAYLEY beside him as a monument to self-deception, or used violence to silence what he feared hearing, then he would save nothing except the hollow shell of his pride. So when Bill placed all the evidence on the table, it was both an act of reclaiming justice and the moment he stood before his own sentence. From that moment on, he was not only judging HAYLEY or Randy. He was judging the entire chain of choices that had led him there, his arrogance, his obsession, his pride, his selfishness, and even his fear of being seen as weak. Bill could expose everything. He could seek revenge. He could hide the truth. He could even commit an unforgivable crime. But no matter what path he chose, the one thing he could not escape forever was the shame of realizing that he, the man who had always believed he controlled everything, had ultimately been led into the deepest trap of all by his own need to be loved and admired. And that realization, more than any scheme ever built around him, was the fuse that would make every decision Bill made next more dangerous, more dramatic, and more unpredictable than anything that had come before.